All right, well, you know what, Caitlin, I don't see anybody else. I'll keep monitoring, letting folks in as needed, but with that, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
All right, sounds great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. The talk tonight is about CREEM magazine and the civil rights movement of the 1970s and 80s. I just passed my 8-year anniversary here at the Birmingham Museum, and our CREEM magazine collection and exhibit was my first major project here at the museum. So I am very excited to finally get to talk about it. And I think you'll see like it was pretty unique in rock and roll magazines, both in how they covered these issues and kind of how they thought of themselves and the music and the culture that they were following. So we're going to start off with, oh, if I can advance. There we go. All right. So in November 1971's issue, 20 out of 80 pages were dedicated to covering the deaths of George and Jonathan Jackson and covering the Soledad brothers. And the question was, why should a mere rock paper devote a portion of its issue to a pair of murdered Black revolutionaries? CREEM editor Dave Marsh asked in his Looney Tunes column in that issue. In August of 1970, Jonathan Jackson had held up a courtroom during the trial of James McLean and took several hostages in an attempt to free his brother George Jackson, along with his compatriots Fleta Drumgo and John Clutchett. George Jackson, as well as Drumgo and Clutchett, were known as the Soledad brothers. 3 prisoners held at Soledad Prison who were active in the Black Liberation Movement and who also held strikes and protests for equal and better living conditions for the prisoners. The 3 had also been arrested for the death of a prison guard after a riot between Black prisoners and members of the Aryan Brotherhood, during which a prison guard shot and killed 3 Black inmates without firing any warning shots. Many believed that the death of the guard was pinned on these 3 solely because they were a thorn in the side of the prison administration. Jonathan Jackson was 17 when he attempted to free his brother and was killed in his attempt to leave the courthouse with hostages. George Jackson, who had been sentenced to 1 year to life for robbery, died later after allegedly launching a riot at San Quentin prison, and his death is considered highly sus. The 2 remaining Soledad brothers, Drumgo and Clutchett, were acquitted of killing the prison guard after a jury found that the state had failed to completely prove its case. So, again, why would CREEM magazine cover this? The early 1970s saw the civil rights movement spark uprisings and riots at prisons across the country as prisoners protested against racial prejudice in the justice system and in the prisons themselves, and as well for humane treatment for all prisoners. The most famous of these was the Attica Uprising, which occurred on September 9th, 1971, and lasted until September 13th of that year. Over 1,000 prisoners took 42 staff members hostage in an attempt to get their demands met. Eventually, the New York governor ordered armed corrections officers and state and local police to regain control of the prison, leading to the deaths of 39 people, including civilian employees and prisoners. But again, that still doesn't answer the question of why, right? So often today, many seek to divorce media, like music, from the people who make it, or the political moments or movements that inspire it. And that's why you'll see so many politicians using songs like Creedence Clearwater's Fortunate Son or Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, and often ironically hilarious ways. I'm just saying, if you dodged a draft or you've never had family members fight in any war, maybe Fortunate Son isn't the song to use at your political rallies. And Born in the USA isn't the jingoistic nationalist anthem that so many seem to think it is. And those were just the first two examples that popped into my head of this. And I'm sure we can all think of more, and we're going to see a lot more this year because it's an election year, and politicians on both sides of the aisle make really weird choices. Reading lyrics is a dying skill set, I guess. And there's always been this pull between the culture that inspired the music and the politics behind that culture, and the artists and folks who listen to the music who may not be embedded in that cultural political mindset. And then, of course, sometimes there's tension between the not great things that an artist has done and the bangers that they've written and performed. But of course, you're still thinking, why? And we'll get to that, I promise. But first, I want to talk about CREEM magazine. For CREEM magazine, there was no dividing line between the music and the artist and the music and the culture. A big part of that was due to the fact where the magazine was located. And that was, it started in Midtown Detroit in 1969. And this was in the wake of the Detroit riots or uprisings of 1967, which was one of the many riots taking place around the country in the mid to late 1960s, led by minority groups, primarily Black individuals who were tired of being relegated to poverty, of having to deal with police brutality, of not having access to equal education or housing opportunities. And so the Midtown of 1969 was extremely different than to the gentrified Midtown of today. And the context of this was inescapable to early CREEM writers and editors. And so too was the shift in youth culture. Joan Didion has a very famous quote about how 1969 was the year that the 60s died. And yeah, 1969 was the last year of that decade, but also there were so many cultural changes and political events that were kind of dividing the line between the hippie movement that had come before, where it was about peace and love and good vibes, to something a little bit darker, a little bit more abrasive, a little bit more revolutionary. A lot of people are realizing that the dream of that peace and love didn't quite match the life and political realities of so many groups across the United States. But maybe I should take a step back and explain what CREEM was for folks in the audience who may not have grown up reading it, aren't very familiar with it, aren't like me who has been paid for the last 8 years to read it and analyze it and make exhibits about it and talk about it. So I guess we should start with the fact that their tagline was America's only rock and roll magazine. You may have heard rumors that there were other rock and roll magazines in the United States at this time, and that's not true. I mean, a magazine tagline never lies to you. And the reason why it's in the museum's collection and why I get to talk about it tonight is their offices in 1973 moved to Birmingham, Michigan, and were actually located above the Birmingham Theater. And the offices stayed there until the magazine was sold in 1986 and moved out to California, where it did struggle on for a few more years until video would kill the magazine star. And so why Metro Detroit? So many other rock and roll publications were coming out of New York and California. So why Detroit? Why the middle of the country? And that's because there was a burgeoning musical scene in Detroit. The music coming out of Detroit was, I mean, it was blue collar, it was more in your face, it was rougher, it was dirtier, and it was really, really creative. You had all these different musical genres coming together and blending and inspiring each other. You had Motown, you had blues, you had jazz, and you had country. And yes, I said country. In the 20s, 30s, and early 40s, and kind of moving forward, Before the rise of Nashville, Detroit was actually the epicenter of country music in the United States. And that was due to the auto industry, bringing in people from the South to work in the factories. And people did what people do everywhere. You bring your culture with you. You bring your favorite music with you. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, suck it, Nashville. And CREEM recently has been reborn, and I really enjoy it. If you're into rock and roll criticism, into cultural criticism, with a little bit of irreverence, a little bit of snark, I think it's fantastic. So CREEM was a lot more than just rock and roll music. Rock and roll then and now is a lifestyle, and it's in constant communication with the wider culture, which includes movies, TV, politics, books, gender roles, food, drugs, etc. My talk today will primarily focus on a few civil rights moments, primarily the struggle for equal rights for Black Americans during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that's also going to include commentary on drug laws and how they were enforced, and how classicism fueled the moral panic over metal music in the 1980s. One of the things that I think CREEM did so well is examining the intersection between race and class when it came to how rock and roll music was seen in the wider culture in the United States. And so, with that in mind, though, I'm in no way claiming that CREEM magazine was a perfect publication who got everything right all the time. In hindsight, we can see that issues of feminism, LGBTQ plus rights, and other issues were glossed over or not even gone into detail or sometimes ignored altogether. And so, with all that context out of the way, you're still probably asking, but why? Why spend all this time talking about two dead revolutionaries in the prison industrial context? And the simple answer is that folks in the rock industry were paying attention to the happenings in American prisons at this time. John Lennon, who had recently separated from the Beatles and embarking on his own solo career, would perform a song about the Attica uprising live on national television. Bob Dylan wrote a popular song about the life of George Jackson. And in more recent times, Tupac and Ja Rule have used the Soledad brothers as inspiration behind their music. So for the big CREEM heads, and that is what I'm calling people who read CREEM magazine now, sorry about that, they'll note that this isn't the first time that the magazine covered famous prisoners or had issues or pages of the magazine dedicated to them. In fact, the very first issues of the magazine contain quite a bit about and by a man named John Sinclair. So who was John Sinclair? Here I have a brief timeline of his life for our purposes. The man has done a lot. He's quite prolific. And that name might sound familiar to you if you've recently gotten out of a time machine from either 1969 or 2018. In 1969, John Sinclair, who was a poet, the manager of the MC5, founder of the White Panther Party, and a person involved in a communal living project called Trans Love Energies, which at that time was a couple of apartments for himself and people associated with the MC5, etc., was giving a 10-year sentence for marijuana possession. He was carrying the equivalent of 2 marijuana cigarettes. John was incredibly busy in the 1960s, and apparently communes are a lot easier to set up than I had been led to believe. All this time, I thought you needed at least a couple of acres and one guy who never combed his hair who also believed he was God. But apparently, you don't need that. Do with that information what you will. For me, I'll be starting a commune after this talk, so that'll be fun. So John was at the forefront of the Detroit music scene. He was involved in social justice, and like most everyone cool at the time, smoked pot. The straight edge scene, which is kind of a subset that grew out of the punk rock music scene, where you don't do drugs or smoke or drink or any like that, would evolve a couple decades after this. And this aligned really well with two of CREEM's biggest names. We have Barry Kramer, who founded the magazine, who, among his other business ventures, owned a head shop and also an album store. And Dave Marsh, an early editor of the magazine, who was an early member of the White Panther Party. And actually, I had a picture of them earlier. So this is on the left, you have Barry Kramer. In the middle is Dave Marsh. And then on the right there is Lester Bangs, who is a legendary rock critic who worked for CREEM for a couple of years there. So if you're anything like me 8 years ago, when you first started reading CREEM, you're like, what is the White Panther Party? And in order to talk about that, we have to talk a little bit about the Black Panther Party real quick. So the Black Panther Party was founded in 1966 by Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton in Oakland, California. And it sometimes went by the name of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And in large part, it originated in order to protect Black folks from police abuse. And they did this through open carry patrols. And so you see Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton on the right there. Newton is armed. And what these individuals would do is they would patrol the streets with weapons and actually sit there and observe the police as they pulled over or questioned Black individuals. They would also make sure that the person being questioned would know their constitutional rights. And if that person was being detained or taken back to the station, they would make sure that that person had a number for a lawyer to call when they got there. And this was needed in Oakland, California at this time because a lot of the police officers in the Oakland police force were being recruited from the Jim Crow South. And it was well known that the police department would turn a blind eye to police brutality against minorities. And in an age before everyone had a cell phone on them that could take video and upload it online and social media, these armed patrols were kind of a way of keeping the worst of the bad apples in check and maybe protecting some of these individuals. And so, and fun fact, California's strict gun laws are in large part due to a backlash against the white power structure due to the Black Panthers open carrying. And a lot of them were signed into law by then California Governor Ronald Reagan. And after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, the message of the Panthers went more mainstream in the Black community, although they were already incredibly popular in California. The thinking went that if the man who preached nonviolence and led peaceful marches could be killed by the white power structure, why should we pursue nonviolence? But that's not all the Panthers did. They established the first free breakfast program in the country for school children, as well as free tutoring, childcare, and medical clinics in their communities. And before the establishment of WIC, they actually had nutrition programs for women and children as well. And the movement spread. It quickly linked up with other groups in the political left at that time, including feminist groups, gay liberation groups, environmentalist groups, etc. In Chicago, where the Panthers really became popular, they hooked up with the Young Lords, which was a Latino street gang, along with other gangs across the city, and actually got them to institute a lot of these programs as well. And they even started making alliances with white middle-class suburban groups, which led the FBI led by J. Edgar Hoover, who many historians, including this one, consider to be the worst, got very upset, very scared, and started to find a way to take the Panthers and allow these other groups down. And if you ever want a really depressing rabbit hole to go down, look up the COINTELPRO program, and your night will be ruined. But back to the White Panthers. They were started by a group of white folks who asked Huey P. Newton what white folks could do to support the Black Panthers. And he responded maybe they could form their own group that could support both the Panthers and other similar groups in their own communities. And so a lot of folks, like John Sinclair, formed the White Panther Party. And of course, as I already mentioned, Dave Marsh was an early member. And this anti-racist, pro-pot political orientation really shows up in early CREEM. And unlike a certain Rolling Stone editor who recently showed his whole behind recently by saying that there were no notable Black artists of this time period to cover, CREEM staffers covered all sorts of rock and roll acts and also covered blues, jazz, R&B, Motown, and other acts because clear boundaries between genres has never really existed, then or now, despite what some gatekeepers might like you to think. And in fact, Dave Marsh is often credited in many circles, including this one, with coining the phrase punk rock in 1971. And Dave Marsh did this in a review of a show put on by a band called Question Mark and the Mysterians. They were a band out of Bay City, Michigan, and they were composed of children of migrant workers from Mexico and Latin America. So to bring this all back to John Sinclair, so he went to prison, and on December 10th, 1971, the John Sinclair Freedom Rally was held in Ann Arbor's Chrysler Arena and attracted musical luminaries like John Lennon and Yoko Ono, The Up, who were the house band of the Grande Ballroom in Detroit, Commander Cody and his Lost Planet Airmen, saxophonist and educator Archie Shepp, Bob Seger, and Stevie Wonder. In addition, there were speakers including Bobby Seale of the Black Panthers, Jerry Rubin, Allen Ginsberg, and Jane Fonda, among others. And this event attracted 15,000 folks into the arena. CREEM published their in-depth coverage of the event in their March 1972 issue. And I have the cover on the screen right now. And they covered it in their article called Free John and Yoko. And this was written by editor Dave Marsh, who is on the right there, and 18-year-old CREEM writer and DJ at WRIF, Richard Pinkston, on the left. And this article strikes a balance between social commentary, music knowledge, and the irreverence that made the magazine unique among its peers. Pinkston in the article describes himself as, quote, "Black and 18, at a rally for some cat whose politics I don't much agree with. I dig the music. Like a growing number of Black people who dig rock and roll enormously, which is a whole other story, I came to dig the tunes," end quote. And in the same kind of paragraph, he questions how Berry Gordy let Stevie Wonder perform at such a political rally. Sure, he notes, the Jackson 5 would perform at NAACP dinners, but that was quite different from a rally for a political activist who was imprisoned for the possession of marijuana. But he does note, maybe a little cynically, that Stevie Wonder was the coolest Motown artist at the time. And this rally was attended by the coolest people at the time. So it made sense. And so at the end of the article, they do note that a couple days after this, John Sinclair was released on bond after a change in Michigan law They actually dropped down the sentence of the amount of marijuana that Sinclair was in possession of from 10 years to 1 year. So the article kind of takes a shot at people who believe that the quote vibrations of the rally had a change, had a hand in changing this law. The Beatles don't free people from jail here, Marsh wrote. A 2-year battle in the legislature did that. And if these vibrations were so powerful, he goes on to say, why wasn't Sinclair granted amnesty? After all, the folks at the rally wanted him free, not just released on bond. All in all, at 4 p.m., John and Yoko finally go on stage. People are bored, people had left, and to cap it all off, John and Yoko bring out acoustic guitars and sing a measly 4 songs. The best one, both writers say, was about the IRA, which is a whole nother topic for a whole nother time and probably a whole other institution. And the whole thing smacked a little too much of ego and the cult of personality for our writers. But they do end on a somewhat positive note. Quote, maybe with a little luck and a little time and a few more events like this, but without the television screens and the ego tripping on all sides, maybe we can bring a whole lot more people home. Like Pun Plamondon and Angela Davis for a start, and then maybe Tim Leary or Eldridge Cleaver. Leary got asylum in Switzerland that week. Huey Newton's murder charge was dropped, and John Sinclair came home. Maybe more stars than just Lennon were on our side, end quote. And here I have a picture of John and the horrific acoustic guitar. Bob Seger, who both writers agreed was one of the breakout stars of the evening. And I love the caption above Stevie Wonder's picture here. And it says, Barry Gordy wants John Sinclair on the street. So I mentioned Tim Leary, and I know many people watching right now might be familiar with him, but if you're not, let's give you a brief little background here. Leary was a controversial psychologist who advocated for the use and research into psychedelic drugs. His book, Jail Notes, which was reviewed in the same 1971 issue where the death of George Jackson was covered, recounts the first 7 months of his incarceration for possession of marijuana. In September 1970, Leary would escape from the minimum security prison he was held in with the help of the Weather Underground Organization, a far-left militant group, which further would cement his legacy as a countercultural hero. Leary believed that a lot of our societal problems could be solved if we all just dropped some acid. And because sometimes history is a flat circle, you will see that same comment stated by people on social media today who make using pot or microdosing their entire personality. So, but not so fast, says Dave Marsh in his review of the book. And yeah, I'm talking a lot about Dave Marsh tonight. If Dave Marsh has many fans, I am one of them. If Dave Marsh only has one fan, that is me. If Dave Marsh has no fans, I am dead. I hope he's still cool. I've lately been kind of burned by rock stars and other kind of cultural figures of this time period who are now saying really like just mean things about modern culture or how kids these days need to get off his lawn. So Dave Marsh, if you're watching, I hope you're still cool. So Dave Marsh says, quote, it might be better for him to relate what his white skin privilege means to what his economic status means, to what life is really like, end quote. And when I first read this review, I was really struck by the phrase white skin privilege. I just naturally assumed that white privilege was a fairly new modern turn of phrase to examine the ways in which society still functions to maintain the racial status quo, even though many forms of discrimination have become illegal. For example, there's the well-worn example of employers discriminating potential employees based on whether or not the resume has a quote unquote ethnic name. And while this phrase did gain popularity in the 1980s through the work of Peggy McIntosh, the phrase white skin privilege actually goes back really, really far. The first time we see it in print is in 1837 in an article in the newspaper called The Liberator, which was an abolitionist newspaper. And in that article, they're talking about the privileges of whites, which at that time meant being able to be considered a citizen, being able to vote and hold property, etc. So while the phrase might be slightly different, the idea and philosophical underpinnings are much the same as they were in 1837, which isn't a depressing thought at all. And so while I could write a whole dissertation on rock and roll as a medium to examine social, cultural, and legislative changes in the early 1970s, I'm not going to subject you all to that. We are going to fast forward to 1985, the year that saw Dee Snider of Twisted Sister, looking like Dee Snider of Twisted Sister, testify before Congress. Some academics have classified the 1980s as sort of a backlash to the perceived excesses of the 1960s and 70s. The strides that many minority groups had made during the previous decades were now seen as going too far or too extreme. Free love and women's rights were decried by the newly emerged religious right that fought for a return to quote unquote traditional values. Gay and lesbian liberation was overshadowed and pushed back in the closet over fear of AIDS. And in an era where greed and overconsumption was seen as good, nothing could be worse than looking or being poor. Even the music industry was growing more conservative and actually segregating artists. Black, Latino, or female artists were being pushed out of rock and roll and were now being relegated into genres like R&B. Rhythm and blues was a category that was kind of underneath the subheading of rock and roll. And during the 1960s and 70s, a lot of people would say artists like the Rolling Stones were really great R&B artists. In the 1980s, the Rolling Stones were now solidly in the rock category, and R&B was seen as predominantly Black artists. But that didn't mean that the battle for civil rights was over, or that no one was paying attention to these issues. And so the reason why Dee Snider, looking like Dee Snider, was testifying before Congress in 1985 was because of an organization called the Parent Media Resource Center, or PMRC. They were formed in 1985 and sought to get the music industry to impose a rating system on all albums released, similar to the MPAA ratings found on movies. So during a 5-hour porn rock hearing before the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, senators heard from their fellow politicians, concerned parents, and Frank Zappa, Dee Snider, and John Denver in September 1985. And if you think that's a random assortment, it truly is. And you can go on YouTube and watch these hearings and watch all 3 of their testimonies. And it's really interesting. Dee Snider, it gives a very eloquent kind of defense of his music and his lyrics, primarily the music video for the song We're Not Gonna Take It. And John Denver shows up and tells this really funny story about how some radio stations would not play his song Rocky Mountain High because they thought it was about getting high on substances instead of just, being several hundred feet above sea level. So at this point, though, in August of that year, the industry had already compromised and agreed to put parental advisory stickers on albums with explicit lyrics in them. And if you're of my generation or younger, you might remember walking into a music store and buying a tape or a CD specifically because it had that parental advisory sticker on it, because you wanted to see what all the fuss was about. You wanted to be edgy. And in fact, a lot of data suggests that music with the parental advisory stickers on them sold more than music who did not have that. And Tipper Gore was one of the figureheads of the PMRC, and she would become a running joke in CREEM ever after this. So I am going to put up a list of the Filthy 15. And these were songs specifically called out by the Parents Resource Media Center for being the most objectionable. And if you are a fan of any of these artists or just music of this time period, you might look at this list of artists and start to see some similarities here. So we have Prince on this list, Sheena Eastman, Judas Priest, Vanity, Motley Crue, AC/DC, Twisted Sister, Madonna, Wasp, Def Leppard, Merciful Fate, Black Sabbath, the Mary Jane Girls, Venom, and Cyndi Lauper. And so even today, a lot of people look at this PMRC hearing as simply a case of adults not understanding that how they felt about Prince was the same way that their parents felt about Elvis. An example of how, to quote Will Smith, parents just don't understand. Was it really, though? In the February 1986 issue of CREEM, Richard C. Walls, who was a regular writer for CREEM at this point, and by this point, many of the early writers and editors had moved on and found other opportunities, and some, like Barry Kramer and Lester Bangs, had passed away. And he wrote this really long kind of review of these hearings. But the part that really sticks out to me was, quote, "And if that way of looking at it seems too fanciful for you, try this take. The vast majority of examples continually given of objectionable lyrics are either by Black performers and or heavy metal groups, suggesting that perhaps the perceived threat to authority is more class-based than generational. The whole thing maybe just be a hardcore middle class trying to protect themselves from the grunge below, of bourgeois cultural majoritarians feeling threatened by a group of foul-mouthed Negroes and uncouth whites of dubious social status. It could be just that corny." Walls, in my opinion, in this analysis, miss the examples of female artists on this list who sang, sometimes in ways that society at that time deemed very crudely, of their own sexual pleasure. And yeah, this is shades of the more current cultural controversy over a song called WAP. And no, I can't tell you what WAP stands for because my boss is watching and I want to keep my job here. From the start of the magazine's run, the original run, you'll notice that I'm not talking about the current run right now. I think, maybe in the future I will. But including the time that it was based out of Birmingham, equality, particularly when it came to race and class, were at the forefront of CREEM's coverage of rock and roll. To the writers and editors, music wasn't just music, nor should the musicians simply shut up and play music. Music was an expression of the zeitgeist and a vehicle for change. So thank you so much for coming out and joining us tonight. If you've enjoyed this talk, coming up at the museum at the end of this month, we have our Black History Talks on Saturdays here at the museum. And on February 24th, 2024 at 11 a.m., I will be talking about CREEM magazine and how they covered Black artists of the 1970s and 80s. Really interesting stuff, including CREEM covering hip hop acts like Run DMC and Motown artists and others. So if you love music of that time period, if you love Black artists of that time period, if you want to hear more about CREEM, you should definitely come and check it out. We'd love to have you. And that Saturday before, February 17th, one of my colleagues will be talking about the Harris Jackson family and a century of being Black in Birmingham and all the cultural changes and social changes that that family saw in the city. And those tickets are $10 for each of those events and can be purchased online, over the phone, or here in person at the museum. And next month at 7 p.m., a free talk here at the Baldwin Public Library. My colleague Donna Casticelli will be talking about Birmingham's pioneer women, the Prindle sisters. And these are three women who came to Birmingham in the late 18 teens, early 1820s, and put their mark on the city. And their story is super remarkable. And if you want to learn more about CREEM magazine, we do have our exhibit here at the museum. And it's also part of our current exhibit, A Tapestry of Birmingham, Exploring Our Diversity. And so we're not just talking about CREEM, we're talking about a lot of stories from Birmingham and its historic diversity. And we are open Tuesday through Saturday, 1 to 4 p.m. You can find us on our website, Facebook, Instagram. And if you can't get enough of my voice, I am the host of the Birmingham Museum's podcast called Birmingham Uncovered. And the first week of every month, we release a new episode. Our recent episode was about Harris Makis, restaurant entrepreneur, war hero, and the guy from whose parking lot Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. It's a fun story and it's a fun ride. So thank you so much, and I will open this up for questions now, if anyone would like to ask any questions.
Caitlin, there's a question in the chat from Nancy. She wanted to know what happened to the original editors of CREEM.
Oh, that's such a good question. So a lot of the early editors are still around. And in fact, before we started recording, Jen and I were talking about one of the early editors, Susan Whitehall, who was from Birmingham. She is still a freelancer at the Detroit News. She still covers music. Jan Uhelski, another early editor, is now working with the relaunch of CREEM, and in fact was one of the editors on their recent issue on the life and legacy of Lester Bangs. I just looked up his Wikipedia. Dave Marsh is still around. And editors like Robert Christgau went on to work for the Village Voice. Some of them did go to CREEM's major competitor at the time, Rolling Stone. In fact, when Lester Bangs left CREEM, allegedly after an argument with Barry Kramer, he went back to Rolling Stone for a few years before his death. So a lot of these writers and editors are still around. We are fortunate enough to be in contact with many of them here at the museum. And when we opened up our CREEM exhibit several years ago, many of them came out. They were very excited and a little weirded out to see their work, being put up in a museum like you would. So many of them were like these little punk kids who, were countercultural and, trying to do a thing and just messing around and, seeing your stuff that you were doing at that time in a museum might be a little weird. Donna, I too hope that Dave Marsh sees this and visits. Again, I think I am his biggest fan.
I didn't know that. I'm just reading Leslie's comment in the chat. CREEM's Lester Bang is featured in the film Almost Famous, starring Philip Seymour Hoffman. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so fun fact, Cameron Crowe, who wrote that movie, um, in the script, it says that, he was working with Rolling Stone at the time. Actually, he said in a later interview, so much of that movie was based off his time writing for Creem magazine. But at the time the film was being released, this was kind of in the years that Creem magazine was no longer operating. So Rolling Stone was a little bit more culturally relevant. So he kind of just inserted Rolling Stone where Cream was. And according to the Cream staffers, Philip Seymour Hoffman wasn't a physical match to Lester Bangs, but he got like the voice and the cadence and the way he moved and everything like down to a T. They said it was really spooky.
I'm gonna have to
And
rewatch it now.
yeah, and part of like Cream's irreverence came from this fact, which Philip Seymour Hoffman as Lester Bangs in the movie talks about, they would always say things like the musicians aren't our friends. And at that time, Rolling Stone still does sometimes have this reputation for never publishing bad reviews of music. And a lot of their interviewers at that time would kind of like try to cozy up to rock musicians and everything. And the Cream writers were like, no, like these people aren't our friends. Like we can make fun of them. We can write bad reviews if we want. We're not beholden to the artist. So
I have a quick question. Did I know nowadays, and actually for the last 20 so years, like Rolling Stone has become known for its editorial portion, its non-music. Is that something that existed? Like obviously Cream was doing that, clearly.
mhm.
Is that something that Rolling Stone was also doing at the same time, or is it something they sort of they became doing more as like magazines like Cream did it and it was successful?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like Cream's tagline kind of came into the fact they would sometimes like take shots at Rolling Stone for like not writing about music, which was really interesting because Cream was not either sometimes. So yeah, from a very early time, Rolling Stone was kind of taking some of those editorial stances. I don't think as far or as deeply felt as Cream. It seemed like for a lot of the writers and editors of Cream, they were within those subcultures more and talking about it from that place. Whereas Rolling Stone was really trying to be eagle-eyed about it and seeing the issues from above rather than from the ground up, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. Oh, Caitlin. Leslie says Caitlin is the Birmingham Museum's Cream expert. Well, 8 years of research and knowing, I'm sure.
Yeah,
How,
I've read every single issue of Cream magazine. I joke that I know more about Kiss's career than Gene Simmons does, but to be fair, I've done significantly less drugs than Gene Simmons has. So,
you're probably a better human being too.
I try. I do try.
It's a low bar. Gene Simmons, I think it's a pretty low bar.
It really is. It really is. But yeah, it's really interesting. One of the things that I like so much about Cream is just how um timely it still reads today. Like you can pick it up and it's still very recognizable. It's snarky in all the right places. A lot of the writing really holds up. It's fun. It really is. And if you subscribe to the current incarnation of Cream Magazine, you also get access to their online archive. So if you are a big fan of, say, like Bob Seger, you can actually go into the archive and search and find every single issue, article, every single review, every single picture of Bob Seger. I love looking at Cream Magazine's coverage of Bob Seger because they were one of the first magazines to really champion this guy. There's a couple artists that really make it onto the mainstream because Cream was like championing these people. So like Bob Seger is one, Alice Cooper is one. They have a lot to answer for with Ted Nugent, but we'll let that slide for right now. And every single picture, I try to go through Cream and find pictures where Bob Seger isn't looking like absolutely delighted to be there. And I found like one, and that's because he is like trying really hard not to smile because he's posing with like these other rock and roll artists who are like, I'm serious. And Bob Seger's like, I'm serious too. Oh yeah, and Leslie says Iggy Pop. Yeah. Iggy Pop and the Stooges were also MC5. Uh, Susan Whitehall is still like really upset on Twitter. I refuse to call it X. Every time the MC5 are not admitted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and I agree.
It's funny. Uh, we still have people hanging out. Does anyone have any other questions or comments or memories they have from the time? Anything they want to share with us? Like I said, you can type in the chat, or if you're comfortable unmuting yourself, can.
What are your favorite songs on the Filthy 15, everyone?